Alright, so here we are on our first playthrough, and when we unlock all enemies, we get an NPC telling us something. This dialogue is only gonna show up once, and now if we die and play again, on our second playthrough, we see the NPC right at the start, and it's gonna give us a different message. On your first sail, you travel 77 yards. That's the actual score that we had before. Here's a little something to get you going. As you can see, a little booty animation appeared, and we actually got some money. Hi, I'm Ricky. Today we are on the 35th episode of the Endless Runner series, and today we'll do part 2 of our NPC system. In part 1 we've put the basis of our NPC questline system, so we've made the actual NPC and a way to call him and give him a certain dialogue. Now we see how to inject code into our dialogues. If you haven't watched part 1, go watch it now because we're gonna rely on it. Remember to join my Discord channel if you want some programming helps, and follow me on Twitter to get updates or whatever video I'm currently making. I'm also developing a new game for PC, it's called AA, and there's a teaser trailer, all links in the description. Alright, let's start. Here we are in our Endless Runner, in the level scene. For NPC questlines, we're gonna make one new script that handles all the different quests. And that's actually gonna be a static one. So let's go in our assets, and let's create a new script here. Let's open it and make it static. By having a new script altogether, we can have more options, we can do more things in our quests. Right now we already have an NPC dialogue which we call when we unlocked all enemies. Let's go grab Unlock Enemies Manager real quick, and in here you can see we have the increased difficulty function, and at the very end of it we call the NPC Manager and activate an NPC. Now instead of doing that directly, let's instead call the NPC quests. So let's go here, let's make a new function, and make sure to mark it as public and static. And as the name suggests, we're gonna call it when we unlock all enemies. Then in NPC quests, we just pass the code that we stole. Alright, now that we've moved the code here, let's do something with it. In this case, I don't want to show this dialogue twice. So to do that, let's use player prefs. So we check if this player pref is 0. And to use player prefs, we have to add back the Unity Engine library. And if it is 0, so if it's the first time that we see this bit of code, then we put the player pref to 1 and call our NPC. Now we could have just put this bit of code in here, but that will make the code dirty in our Unlock Enemies Manager. I've been asked by a guy on Discord about some few examples of the solid principle in our game. If you don't know, the solid principle is a set of rules in the programming community to guide you to make a good, clean code, where each letter of solid stands for one principle. The first principle, which is probably also the most important, is the S, and it stands for single responsibility, which means that a single script should have a single responsibility. So Unlock Enemies Manager should only do one thing, unlocking enemies. If you want to do something that doesn't really correlate with unlocking enemies, that thing should be very simple and quick, like calling a single function. Putting this bit of code here will break the single responsibility principle. This function right here is basically just a callback. Alright, so now that we've done that, let's go back to NPC Quests, and we can see that now we do something just once, thanks to player prefs. And that one thing that we do is calling a certain NPC dialogue. In our case, we still have the test string. Let's change that to a new dialogue, which I'm gonna call Unlock All Enemies. Let's copy that. Let's go to Unity. And now if you remember, in our prefabs, we have the test dialogue. Let's delete it. Let's go to Assets. Let's make a new folder for dialogues. Let's make a new scriptable dialog. And as the name of the file, I'll pass the same thing that we copied. And also as the dialog name, I'm gonna pass in the same thing. And now I'm gonna make a real quick dialog. Hey there, Bertie, looks like you reached the end of the scene. Not. The enemies and weather events may be finite, but the world isn't. See ya. This may seem as an aesthetic-only dialogue, but it's actually telling the player that the gameplay that it's gonna see from now on, it's gonna be a typical Endless Runner. There are no more enemies or weather events after this NPC. Of course, this dialogue is just an example, but I think it's also a very nice thing to say. Alright, now let's go in our game manager, NPC dialog magazine, and here we have the missing dialog test that we had before. Let's just fill it with a new one. Let's clear player prefs and test it. Once we unlock all possible enemies, we're gonna see our NPC. Here it is. Here we get our dialog. Ooh, looks like the text is out of a bounding box. We're gonna fix that later. The dialog ends, the NPC goes away, and we return to our normal gameplay. And because we've seen the NPC once, if now we reset the game, we don't see him again. Alright, to fix the text issue, let's go in our canvas, game panel, NPC dialog box, dialog text, and let's set it to auto size. And let's put the maximum size to 36. That should fix it. Alright, so that's it for our first dialog. Now let's make a new dialog. I'm gonna call it second playthrough. I'm gonna copy it, set it to the dialog name as well, make the dialog real quick. Hey there boaty, on your first sail you'll travel X amount of yards. That's impressive. Here's a little something to get you going. See ya. Now the two lines that we're gonna inject, it's gonna be this one, where we're gonna replace this bit of text with the actual yards that we traveled in the playthrough before. And then this one, where we're gonna give the player a bit of money and show a little animation. Alright, before we do that, let's go in our game manager and let's add this new dialog. Alright, and now we need a way to actually call it. So let's go back to NPC Quest, and we need to add a way to know how many games the player has played. To do that, let's make a function that we call every time the player finishes a playthrough. And make sure that it's public and static. I've called it onGameEnd. Let's go grab our finish game manager. In here we have a function called finish game. I also have a function called restart game. We want to call the NPC Quest onGameEnd right before we restart the game. The problem with putting it here is that we're also calling restart game right before an advertisement. And in the event that the player closes the game before completely watching the advertisement, we still want to keep the player's progress. So instead of calling onGameEnd here, let's call it at the top. So when the player chooses to restart the game, we already saved its progress, we already saved the playthrough to be completed, and only then we try to watch an advertisement and or restart the game. Alright, so now we have this function that is called every time we complete a gameplay. To save the amount of playthroughs, let's use a new player pref. Now we just need to take the player pref's amount and add one to it. Okay, so now we have the amount of games. Now we just need to check at the start of a game if the current amount of games played is 1, and if so, we call our NPC. So let's make a new function very similar to this one called onGameStart. Let's grab the start game manager and let's call NPC Quests. Very good. In here let's use player prefs again. And let's call the NPC manager. Make sure that the string parameter is the same one that we have here in Unity in our dialog name. Alright, let me clear player prefs and test it. First time around, we don't see the NPC. On our second playthrough, before anything happens, here we get our NPC and we get our dialog. And by the way, we can also keep going and get the other quest lines, because they are independent. Now, as I said before, I want to change the dialog that is here and here. To do that, we need a way to actually know which part of the dialog we are at currently. So let's go back to NPC Quest and let's make a new function. I've called it onDialogLoad because we're going to call it with each line of the dialog of our current quest line, and then second playthrough because that's the name of our quest. And finally the parameter telling us which dialog index we're at currently. Now how we call this function is going to be a bit different. Let's go in our NPC manager, and in here we already have a function that we call every time we iterate through the current dialog. What I want to do is call the function that we just made right here. But the thing is, I don't want to call that function, the second playthrough function, every time we have a dialog, only when we have that particular dialog. But at the same time, I don't want to search through which dialog is currently being loaded and then tell if I want to call that function rather than another, and then also have to keep track of all the different functions and dialogues. That's really messy. Instead, what we're going to use is delegates. Delegates are a fantastic feature, not of Unity, but of C#, which act as containers for functions. If you think about it, we already seen one. It's the buttons. When we look at a button through the inspector, let me show it right now, we have this thing called onClick. This is a type of delegate. We can add events to this delegate by using the plus or minus sign. And then every time we click the button, all the functions that are loaded within this button event are going to be called. And the key thing here is that it doesn't matter which functions are loaded or if there are any functions at all. When you press the button, the delegate is going to try and call those functions and not worry about them. We're going to do the same thing but through code. So back to Visual Studio, let's make our delegate. So we put in the access attribute, we say delegate, and then we pass in the type that is returned by the functions that we want to put in. In our case, we just need a void. Because as you can see in NPC Quest, we have void here. Now let's give a name to this delegate. And finally, the type of parameter that is required. The name doesn't really matter, what's important is the type, which you can see is the same that is here. Alright, now we can't actually use this already, this is just the type of a delegate that I want. To actually use it, we need to make an instance. Again, access modifier, in this case we use the type of a delegate, and then the name. I usually call my delegates the same way of the type, and then add in event at the end. Alright, now we can take this delegate, and here where I put the comment, we can replace it, and use invoke to call all the functions within it. You can see that it gives us an error because it requires a parameter. We can put in current dialog index. So first we load the actual dialog, then we call all the events that have to do something with it, and only after we update the current dialog index. That's because this index is actually going to be the index of the next dialog line. Alright, one final thing though, if there are no functions within our delegate, we do get an error. To avoid that, we first need to check whether there are some events in it. To do so, we could use something very similar to an al check, but it's actually a lot easier for delegates. We can just put a question mark. This question mark here, right before the dot, is going to look inside the delegate and see if there is at least one function loaded within. Alright, now we just need to pass in the function to that delegate. So back to NPC Quest. Before we activate the NPC, let's call the NPC manager again. And here is our delegate. And to load our function, we just use equal. Notice that we're not using the parentheses in this function. That's because we're not calling it, we're just passing it in to the delegate. By using the equal sign, we set this function to be the only one being loaded into the delegate, but you can also use plus equal to instead just add in this event to the delegate. In our case, it doesn't really matter, but it's usually a good practice to just use plus equal. This way you don't accidentally remove some functions that were already inside the delegate. But again, this is mostly for good practice. We don't actually need it right now. Now let's go to NPC Manager, and when we end our dialog, so right here, let's empty the delegate. To remove all the functions loaded within, we just set the delegate to null. So the delegate gets its function when we call the NPC, and then when the dialog ends, the delegate gets reset, so all quests are independent. Perfect, now let's test it out by going to NPC Quest and adding a debug log. Let's go to Unity, here's our NPC, and here's a debug log telling us the current index of the dialog. I've cleared paragraphs again, so you can see that the other NPC doesn't give us any debug logs. That's because its quest line didn't have anything added to the actual delegate. Perfect. Alright, so now in NPC Quest, we have a function that is called when each dialog part is loaded, and we also know which dialog we are currently looking at. So now we just need to check if we are at a certain dialog and then do something. In this case, the dialog 1 is a part of a dialog where we tell the player how many yards he has traveled in the playthrough before. So in this case, we actually want to override the current dialog box. So let's go to NPC Manager and let's add a public property to the dialog box text. Alright, back to quests, and let's call it. And in here we want to replace the part of text where it says yards within the brackets, this part right here. So to do that, we use a function called replace, which takes two string parameters. One is a string to be replaced, and the other is the string that's gonna replace that. Let me break it down into 2 lines. Alright, a bit better. So basically we're gonna look into that dialog line, and every time the function sees this bit of text here, yards, it's gonna replace it with the other string. For now, I just put a dummy string. Now, of course, we don't want the dummy string, we want the actual yards that we traveled before. And we have to get them somehow. Well, we already have a value telling us how many games we have played before. We can just check when the games played are 0, and if they are 0, it means that we are on our first playthrough, and then we can just save the current yards. Notice that I'm getting the games played before we add 1 to it. We're going to use this new value, the yards travel, in the next playthrough, so we need to save it into a player path. We can just use setInt because we don't really care about the yards being float. Then we call the yards manager, we already have a value telling us the yards traveled, and we cast it into an int. Alright, now we just need to get this value and put it here. And make sure to also change them to a string value. Alright, let's go to Unity and let's see how it looks. Here is our NPC. Hey there, Boaty. On your first sail, you travel 11 yards. That is in fact correct. We can go on. See ya, and here it goes. So we got our first dialog line, this one. Now let's do the element 3. In here we want to add money and show an animation. So let's go back to NPC Quest. So to add the money, we already have a script called player money. And in here we have a function called add money and save. We don't want to use that because then we will be saving the amount of money before we actually ended the quest line, and that's not good because that means the player could actually close the game, restart it, and get this bonus over and over. So instead, let's open player money and let's make a new function called add money. And we're going to do the same thing that we do with add money and save. We just don't save it into a player path. Alright, back to NPC Quest. I'm gonna add 100 coins. I think that's good and fair. That's gonna incentivize the player to keep playing. And now for the second part, we could just instantiate a new prefab and then destroy it after a couple of seconds. But if you think about it, we're already doing that kind of thing in a lot of other scripts. So instead, let's go back to Unity, Game Manager, and let's make and add a new component. I've called it Animation Prefabs. In here, let's make a new function to spawn an animation. And we ask for a string telling us which type of animation we want to show. So let's use a switch statement to cycle through it. Then let's add a sprite reference for each of the sprite animations. Let's make a new sprite on the fly. Then, based on the switch statement, we use a certain sprite rather than another. And let's do the same for the different sprites that we use in our animations. Alright, that seems good. Then at the end, we actually want to instantiate the animation. So let's add a new reference game object to our animation prefab. Let's instantiate it. And make sure to do so at the boat's position. Then we want to change the sprite of this prefab based on the one that we got here, the sprite chosen. And make sure to use the get component in children, because the actual sprite renderer is found in a children of the animation prefab. I'm talking about the one that we already use when we get a player bonus or we lose a life, etc. Also, you can see that we get an error when we try to apply the sprite chosen. That's because it technically doesn't exist. To fix this technicality, let's set the sprite chosen to be null by default. Here we go. And finally, let's destroy the animation spawn after a brief delay. And finally, let's make a singleton of animation prefabs. Great, now we can just call this function in NPC Quests. And because we're giving money to the player as animation type, I've put in booty. Now let's go to Unity, and for the animation prefabs, let's go to Animations, and let's bring in the bonus item prefab. Let's pass in also all the sprites. Now let's select our bonus item prefabs that we use in our animation, and because we're going to use this during the dialogue, we want to set the update mode to unscaled time. What this does is it runs the animation regardless of the scale time. And because we set our scale time to 0 when we load a dialogue from the NPC, if we had update mode set to normal, the animation will just freeze. So let's put it to unscaled. Alright, so now as you may have guessed, we want to eliminate the other animation prefabs and change in the code when we call them and just use the animation prefabs. But that's not really part of the tutorial, let's do that later. First, let's do an actual test of what this tutorial is actually about. Alright, I changed the view, let me also clear paragraphs. Alright, so here we are on our first playthrough, let's hit play, and when we unlock all enemies during the gameplay, we get an NPC telling us something, hey there boaty, looks like you've reached the end of a sea, not. The enemies and weather events might be finite, but the world isn't. See ya. This is basically telling the player that the type of enemies that he's gonna find from here on out are gonna be repeating, but the actual gameplay, so the endless runner, it's gonna continue. And of course, this dialogue, it's only gonna show up once, so we're never gonna see this dialogue again. And now if we die, and play again, on our second playthrough, we see the NPC right at the start, and it's gonna give us a different message. Hey there buddy, on your first sail, you travel 77 yards. That's the actual score that we had before. That's impressive. Here's a little something to get you going. As you can see, a little booty animation appeared, and we actually got some money. If we select our player, current money, you can see that we have a nice 103. See you, and the NPC goes away. And now if we continue playing, you can see that we don't get the other NPC quest line that we had before, because that one is done and finished. And if we close and play again, we also don't get the first quest line, because that also is already finished. Alright, so looks like our NPC is actually working. Now let's go ahead and clean the code as I said. Let's go in animation, and let's just delete this, and this. And now let's select our boat player, boat collision, and you can see here that we've deleted the 2 animation prefabs, so let's open it, let's delete them. And now whenever we try to call one of those animations, let's instead call the animation prefabs. So in this coroutine, or lost life without losing, we ask for a parameter the type of animation we want. Let's instead use a string. And let's use that to call the animation prefabs. And then here, let's use a string. And here too. And here we want to use the head start one. And that's it. Let's go to Unity. Let's go to player bonus. Here also we have a couple different sprites for animation and also the item prefab. Let's delete all of them and do the same thing. So we can actually just delete this function and call the animation prefabs directly. Alright, back to Unity, and let's see if it works. So I bought everything here, I bought 1 life, and now in here I'm gonna buy the nets and the lanterns too. Let's also set the player bonus to 1, so it's gonna trigger with each booty collected. Here we get some lantern animations, here we get the booty one. Let me lose a net, so we can actually get the net animation. Here it is, so that also works. And if I hit a whirlwind, here's the heart animation. If I lose and watch an advertisement, I also get the heart, so everything works. Pretty good. Alright, so that's it for this video. I hope you learned something new. If you have any doubts, ask me in the comments or join my Discord channel and you can chat with me in real time. Or you can just join for fun. And if you want, you can also download the entire project for free through Github. By the way, as I said before, I'm also developing a new game for PC called AA. I've already made a teaser trailer about it. And if you want updates on it, you can follow me on Twitter and subscribe to my YouTube. All links in the description. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to support me, and I'll see you next time. See ya!